In the late 1960s, the Ministry of Food quietly dismantled its network of domestic science advisors, those stern women in starched aprons who taught British housewives how to stretch a shilling and keep families fed through the leanest years. Within a decade, techniques that had sustained working-class kitchens for generations vanished almost overnight, replaced by processed meals in garish packets and the seductive promise of convenience. Scientists today are revisiting these abandoned methods with something approaching astonishment, discovering that what grandmothers knew instinctively about preserving nutrients, preventing waste, and maximizing flavor was often more sophisticated than the industrial shortcuts that replaced them. You're about to discover 10 household cooking practices that were dismissed as old-fashioned drudgery but are now recognized as small acts of domestic genius, from the peculiar science behind reusing bacon fat to the unexpected brilliance of washing vegetables in yesterday's potato water. If you care about food that wasn't designed in a laboratory, subscribe to Britain Rewind so these fragments of practical wisdom don't disappear entirely. Number 10. Saving and clarifying beef dripping. Every Sunday roast in a working-class terraced house produced something more valuable than the meal itself, a shallow enamel dish of golden dripping that would be carefully strained through muslin and stored beneath grease-proof paper in the cold larder. This wasn't sentimentality but economics. A pound of beef dripping cost 4 shillings less than butter in 1963, and it transformed Monday's fried bread into something that tasted faintly of the weekend's prosperity. The clarification process removed milk solids and impurities that would cause rancidity, meaning properly stored dripping could last 3 months without refrigeration. It worked because saturated animal fats are chemically stable at room temperature, resistant to the oxidation that spoils vegetable oils. The practice collapsed in the 1970s when margarine manufacturers funded studies linking animal fats to heart disease, conveniently ignoring that factory-processed trans fats were demonstrably worse. Kitchens lost that particular smell, the slightly meaty warmth of dripping melting in a black iron pan on a Tuesday morning, and with it went the understanding that nothing from an animal should ever be wasted. Number 9. Washing vegetables in starchy potato water. Before anyone owned a bottle of vegetable wash, before supermarkets wrapped every carrot in plastic, housewives kept a chipped enamel bowl beside the kitchen sink filled with the cloudy water drained from boiled potatoes. This wasn't laziness but logic. The starch suspended in that tepid liquid acted as a natural surfactant, lifting soil and insects from cabbage leaves and leeks more effectively than cold water alone. The science is simple. Starch molecules surround dirt particles and hold them in suspension rather than letting them resettle, which is precisely how modern detergents function but without the chemical residue. Market vegetables in the 1950s arrived genuinely dirty, still carrying evidence of the fields outside Covent Garden or the allotments in Bermondsey, and this method cleaned them without wasting fresh water. The practice disappeared when vegetables began arriving pre-washed and when washing up liquid became cheap enough to use carelessly. Kitchens lost that faint earthy smell of potato water going grey in the Belfast sink, and with it the knowledge that cleaning doesn't always require something manufactured and sold in a bottle with promises printed on the label. Number 8. Rendering bacon fat for pastry. The fatty rinds trimmed from streaky bacon didn't go in the bin, they went into a small saucepan on the coolest part of the range, rendering down slowly over an hour into pure white lard that made the flakiest pastry working-class families could afford. A quarter pound of bacon produced enough fat for a decent pie crust, and because it was already salted, it required no additional seasoning. The chemical explanation is straightforward. Pork fat has a lower melting point than butter and contains less water, which means pastry made with rendered bacon fat develops distinct layers that shatter rather than crumble. This knowledge sustained families when butter was expensive or rationed, when a meat pie on Thursday might be the only hot meal between Sunday dinner and Friday's fish. The technique vanished when pre-made short crust became available in refrigerated rolls and when health campaigns convinced people that any animal fat was dangerous. The particular smell disappeared too, that sweet fatty warmth of bacon rinds melting down on a Wednesday afternoon, along with the understanding that skill could transform scraps into something both economical and genuinely superior. Number 7. Storing cheese in vinegar-dampened muslin. Before cling film existed, before anyone thought to wrap food in petroleum-derived plastic, hard cheeses lived wrapped in muslin cloths dampened with malt vinegar and stored in the coolest part of the pantry. The vinegar created a mildly acidic environment that inhibited mold growth without penetrating the cheese itself, while the breathable fabric prevented the surface from sweating and turning slimy. A piece of cheddar stored this way would last 6 weeks without refrigeration, developing a firm rind but remaining perfectly edible beneath. The method worked because cheese is a living food that needs to breathe. Sealing it in plastic traps moisture and encourages the wrong kind of bacterial growth, which is why supermarket cheese often tastes of nothing and develops that peculiar slickness. The practice died when fridges became standard and when processed cheese slices promised convenience without care or knowledge. Kitchens lost that sharp vinegar smell mingling with the warm musk of aging cheese, and with it went the understanding that preservation isn't about sealing things away from air but about managing the environment around them with attention and respect. Number 6. Soaking dried peas in bicarbonate solution. Dried marrow-fat peas were a staple of northern working-class cooking, cheap protein that could sit in a jar for months, but they required knowledge to prepare properly. The standard method involved soaking them overnight in cold water with a teaspoon of bicarbonate of soda dissolved in, which softened the skins and reduced cooking time by half. The bicarbonate raised the pH of the soaking water, which broke down the pectin in the cell walls and allowed water to penetrate more efficiently. Without this step, dried peas could simmer for hours and still emerge bullet hard, wasting fuel and time. The practice faded when tin-processed peas became affordable and when younger generations dismissed mushy peas as poverty food rather than recognizing the chemical sophistication required to transform something genuinely difficult into something tender and sustaining. The smell disappeared from kitchens too, that faintly alkaline scent of peas soaking overnight in an earthenware bowl, along with the patience required to understand that some foods demand time and cannot be hurried regardless of what the advertising promises. Number 5. Reviving stale bread in damp tea towels. Bread went stale quickly in the days before plastic bags and chemical preservatives, but throwing it away was unthinkable in households where every penny mattered. The solution involved wrapping the loaf tightly in a clean tea towel dampened with cold water and placing it in a warm oven for 10 minutes, which restored enough moisture and softness to make it usable for another day. The science is straightforward. Starch molecules in bread crystallize as they dry out, which is what causes staleness, and gentle heat combined with moisture reverses this process temporarily by allowing the starch to reabsorb water. This worked because the damp cloth created a steaming environment that penetrated the loaf without making it soggy. The technique disappeared when sliced bread came pre-bagged and when people could afford to waste what they once would have carefully restored. Kitchens lost that particular morning ritual, the smell of slightly scorched linen and warming bread, and with it the knowledge that food has more than one life if you understand how to give it back what time has taken away. If this is bringing back something your own mother or grandmother did without explaining why, you're not alone. Subscribe to Britain Rewind so these practical details don't vanish completely from memory. Number 4. Clarifying dripping with raw potato slices. Even carefully strained dripping could develop off flavors if tiny particles of meat remained suspended in the fat, so housewives would reheat it gently with slices of raw potato stirred through, which absorbed impurities and left the fat crystal clear. The potato's cellular structure acted like a biological filter, its starches bound to proteins and other contaminants, which could then be lifted out when the cooked slices were removed. This process extended the dripping's usable life by weeks and improved its flavor, removing the slightly acrid taste that develops when meat particles oxidize. It required nothing but a potato, heat, and the knowledge that foods can clean each other if you understand their properties. The method vanished when cheap vegetable oils flooded the market and when animal fats fell out of favor entirely. Kitchens lost that quiet process, watching potato slices darken as they pulled impurities from shimmering fat, and with it the understanding that purity doesn't always require industrial intervention but sometimes just patience and observation. Number 3. Storing root vegetables in dry sand. Before anyone had heard of a fridge vegetable drawer, root vegetables lived buried in boxes of builder's sand in sheds and coal cellars, lasting through entire winters without sprouting or rotting. The sand created stable conditions, preventing moisture loss while allowing air circulation, and keeping vegetables separate so that if one spoiled it wouldn't spread. Carrots, beetroots, and parsnips stored this way remained firm and sweet for 4 months, often tasting better in January than they had in October. The practice worked because root vegetables are designed by nature to overwinter underground. Replicating those conditions with sand simply allowed them to do what they evolved to do. It disappeared when supermarkets began offering fresh vegetables year-round and when smaller houses no longer had the storage space. The particular ritual vanished. The autumn day spent layering vegetables in sand while the shed smelled of earth and old wood, along with the knowledge that preservation doesn't require technology but sometimes just understanding what conditions a living thing needs to remain dormant and intact. Number 2. Saving vegetable cooking water for soup stock. Nothing liquid ever went down the drain in a properly run working-class kitchen. The water that had boiled cabbage, carrots, or turnips was poured into a covered jug and added to the stockpot that simmered perpetually on the back of the range. This wasn't frugality taken to absurd lengths but practical nutrition. Those cloudy liquids contained vitamins and minerals that had leached from the vegetables during cooking, particularly water-soluble B vitamins and vitamin C that would otherwise be lost. The stockpot accumulated these nutrients throughout the week, creating a base for soups and stews that was genuinely more nourishing than anything started from plain water. The science supports this completely. Boiling vegetables in water creates a vitamin-rich pot liquor that's often more nutritious than the vegetables themselves. The practice ended when stock cubes promised the same result from a foil-wrap cube and when people stopped making soup from scratch entirely. Kitchens lost that ongoing process, the jug of vegetable water waiting by the stove, and with it the understanding that nutrition isn't always visible but sometimes dissolved and waiting to be recaptured. Number 1. Rendering lamb fat for hand cream. The fatty deposits trimmed from a leg of lamb weren't discarded but rendered down slowly with a handful of lavender flowers, strained through muslin, and cooled into a white salve that working women rubbed into their hands before bed. This wasn't vanity but necessity. Hands that spent all day in washing soda and cold water cracked and bled without protection, and lanolin-rich lamb fat penetrated skin more effectively than any shop-bought cream. The science is sound. Lanolin is chemically similar to human sebum and creates a barrier that prevents moisture loss while allowing skin to breathe. A single rendering produced enough hand cream to last a family through winter, and it cost nothing beyond what would have been waste. The practice vanished when commercial hand creams became affordable and when rendering animal fat seemed too primitive for modern households. Kitchens lost that process, the smell of lamb fat and lavender warming together on a Sunday evening, and with it the knowledge that care for the body doesn't always require purchasing something manufactured but sometimes just understanding what substances naturally heal and protect. These weren't cooking tricks in the sense we understand that phrase today. They were survival knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of generations who understood that thrift and skill were inseparable from feeding a family properly. Modern convenience promised liberation from these small labors, and in many ways it delivered, but it also severed the connection between effort and understanding, between knowing why something works and simply trusting that it does. Industries profited enormously from that severance, selling solutions to problems that had already been solved in kitchens across Britain for generations. Try just one of these methods yourself this week. Save your bacon fat or wrap your cheese in vinegar-dampened cloth, not because you must but because understanding how food actually behaves is knowledge worth possessing. Leave a comment telling us which technique your own family still uses, or which one you'd be willing to attempt. The Britain that knew these things intimately is within living memory still, but only just, and when the last person who rendered dripping as a matter of routine is gone, something irreplaceable will have vanished unless we choose to remember it deliberately and pass it along.